Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this, the first event of VIU's Arts and Humanities Colloquium series for spring 2022. Now, please remember that this campus and the Nanaimo region as a whole is built on the traditional territory of the Nanaimo First Nation. And as guests on this land, we must always be grateful for the opportunity that we have to live and to learn, work and play in this very special place. And hopefully we do our best to advance the process of reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples. My name is Dr. Tim Lewis. I'm a professor in and chair of the VIU History Department, and I've been serving as the MC for these events for quite a few years now, and it's a great honor. I want to welcome both those who are joining us via Zoom. Just a reminder to make sure your screen is on mute. Thank you very much. And welcome to those who are with us here in the beautiful Malaspina Theatre. And as always, the members of the Arts and Humanities Colloquium Planning Committee, headed by VIU English professor Dr. Theo Finnegan, want to extend our sincere thanks to Dr. Marnie Stanley, who is the Dean of Arts and Humanities, because she provides the financial and moral support that we need to continue the work of the colloquium. Quite literally, the series could not go on without her support. And it's become a bit of a standard practice over the years, for better or worse, to add a little musical tribute to Marnie before we get going. And I was inspired today by Leon's impending analysis of a play that centers around the question, what would you do? What would you be prepared to do for $1 million? That, of course, made me think of the Bare Naked Ladies classic, If I Had $1 Million. So I borrowed the tune to produce this little ditty, If You're Gonna Have a Colloquium, which goes a bit like this. If you're gonna have a colloquium, if you're gonna have a colloquium, well, you better have lots of helps. Oh, yes, you need all kinds of help. And if you're gonna have a colloquium, if you're gonna have a colloquium, well, you need financial support, a nice reliant money supply. And if you're gonna have a colloquium, if you're gonna have a colloquium, the dean's gotta have your back, but we got money, so we've no problem. And if you're gonna have a colloquium, make sure money's on your side. If you're gonna have a colloquium, 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 you'll be rich in knowledge, of course, not money. We don't do that. Thank you, thank you. There we go. Well, enough of the opening act. Let's move on toward the feature event of the day. But first, before we bring on Leon, please join me in welcoming to the stage Colloquium Planning Committee Chair, Dr. Theo Finnegan, who will be introducing our featured speaker, Professor Leon Potter. So, Theo, you could join us.
Thank you, everyone. How do I follow that? I'm not going to even try. So Leon Potter has been working in theater and film since 1989. He was originally trained as a set designer, a set and lighting designer at University of Victoria, and later completed his MA with distinction in text and performance and directing at the UK's esteemed Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts and King's College in London. An award-winning actor, Leon's professional credits include shows in London, New York, Edinburgh, Vancouver, and span a myriad of positions, including director, actor, designer, writer, technician, and producer, among others. He's had the privilege of working with a number of really talented actors whom I'm sure you will recognize: Mark Rylance, Alan Rickman, Sir Peter Hall, Fiona Shaw, and Michael Bublé. He began working as a director in 1994 and was the founding artistic director of the Looking Glass Theatre and the artistic director of Blue Peanut Productions as well. Leon is a professional member of the Directors Guild of Great Britain and of the Canadian Actors Equity Association. In more recent years, Leon has been working as a professor at VIU, teaching acting, theatre, history, and public speaking. And he's also been busy performing workshops and adjudication around the province, among other contracts. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Leon Potter.
There was a piece of paper here with my notes. Did you steal my notes? I can wing it if you'd like, but I knew there'd be something. That's awesome. Brilliant. Hi, thank you. Thanks very much for coming. I really, really appreciate it. And welcome all of you. One of the things that we'd like to have a look at is I'd like to start off talking to you a little bit about the theater of the grotesque. So let's begin with that. I was first introduced to the idea of the theater of the grotesque several years ago at the Arts Club Theater. It was actually during a production of Sweeney Todd. And Sweeney Todd was directed by Maurice Panitch. And the way Maurice approached it was from the idea of a theater of grotesque style. And I was fascinated by this. I was like, okay, so what exactly does that mean? The play wasn't natural at all. Each visual element was crafted, right down to the casting, was crafted to be larger than life. The guy he hired to play Sweeney was over 6'6", something like that. He was absolutely monstrous human being. You can see a picture of him there. And put in heels. So suddenly on stage, he was towering over absolutely everybody. And he was this looming figure of foreboding, which is fantastic, okay? The emotions, similarly, over the top. And a lot of the costumes were had bits and pieces sort of added to them to add to sort of a puppet-like nature to what was actually going on. And this was my first glimpse, okay? And I was fascinated. I had done some mask work and some clown work in my time. And it's got a lot of similarities. In clown, when you are feeling something, it's usually felt on a much greater scale than it might be in everyday life, okay? This extremity allows the situation to cross a border, a very important border between tragedy into comedy, right? Mel Brooks, right? Mel Brooks said flat out, if I stub my toe, it's a tragedy. But if I fall down a manhole cover and die, now it's a comedy. And that's essentially what a lot of this, all comedy is actually based on human suffering. One only has to look at it from a certain perspective, right? Comedy equals tragedy plus time, right? And this is an equation that is known from a lot of performers and playwrights and directors and such, right? When you're working with comedy, you never play the comedy, you always play the tragedy to such an extreme extent that suddenly it becomes humorous, right? This is one of the key elements of the theater of the grotesque, is comedy. It has been described as a tragic farce because of its ability to shroud an existential question inside of physical comedy, irony, and absurd stylings. The laughter becomes a cathartic response, liberating the audience from a disorienting bewilderment that is presented on stage. So, what exactly makes the grotesque different from regular farce, from a drawing room comedy with slapstick routines? First of all, it's the rejection of naturalism on stage. The purpose of naturalistic theater is to hold as 'twere a mirror up to nature. That's the idea, to reflect society in a way that allows people to view the world from a different perspective, okay? The main argument being, if you don't like the picture of society presented on stage, don't change the stage, change the society. Makes sense. The avant-garde artists and the anti-realists felt that this was not the best way to get the message across. They felt, because in their words, in the words of Adolf Klurman, two mirrors reflecting each other remain empty. So the second is the grotesque theater's ability to cinch together the contradictory concepts, mixing the beautiful with the cruel, the horrific with the funny, the appalling with the sympathetic. One of the key proponents of the grotesque came from Luigi Pirandello's concept of umorismo, right? Umorismo is the painful laugh and bewilderment in the face of tragic and cruel circumstances. This is the essence of the theater of the grotesque. In a talk by Stanley V. Longman, he proposed 3 syndromes which best describe the elements of the grotesque, which was the marionette, the mirror, and the multiple reality, the M and M. Anyway, so three systems, when you have a look at them, the Marionette Syndrome can best be described in a play. It was first sort of developed in a play by Rosso di San Secondo called O Marionettes, What Passion, okay? And the plot basically goes like this. There are three random characters who meet and are unable to make any sense of their lives, only to discover that they're actually puppets at the mercy of fate. The characters are puppets whose strings are manipulated by forces beyond themselves. And this implies a sort of double consciousness, if you would, on the part of the characters. As puppets, the characters are carried into acts that they would never commit of their own free will. They find themselves stuck in situations that they would never have arranged themselves. They would never choosingly and willingly go into them. But as puppets, as human puppets, they're also aware of the fact that they're being manipulated. And that awareness, right? They can feel the pull of the strings and they can resist it even though it's futile. They can see the absurdity of the situation that they're in, and the consciousness provokes a sense of pain and suffering. Rosso's notes to his actors in his play, Marionette's What Passion, in 1918. The actors should bear in mind that this is a play of desperate pauses. The words they speak veil an exasperation that cannot be endured except in knowing silence. Moreover, the arbitrariness that might seem to be in the drama, resulting from the torment that the characters inflict on themselves, should not give rise to comedy, but rather to a feeling of tragic humorismo. Even though they suffer profoundly human pain, the three characters of the play are like marionettes, and their string is passion, and yet they are human, humans reduced to marionettes and therefore profoundly pathetic. Pirandello was a very large fan of this play, promoted it, and actually it was an influence in a lot of his work as well. The Mirror Syndrome was another one. In his play, The Man Who Met Himself by Luigi Antonelli, the Mirror Syndrome emerges from the stunning awareness that may strike any character upon suddenly seeing themselves from the outside. We rationalize so much of what happens in life. We accept it as normal, logical and reasonable, but these situations may suddenly appear bizarre and absurd when we suddenly see them from the outside. Put a person in an absurd or abnormal situation, and they will often endure it until they can no longer see it. However, if they recognize it, they will either run from it in horror, or they will create a mask to live behind in order to endure it, suffering the martyrdom until one day that they actually erupt. In the Grotesque theater, the playwright displays a variety of circumstances that has the potential to push the character into this kind of devastating recognition. This is the mirror complex. The idea of, if I knew then what I know now, if I could talk to my younger self, what would I do? How would I change it? Luigi Antonelli's The Man Who Met Himself depicts this blatantly, right? His protagonist, Luciano, is on an enchanted island where somebody named Dr. Klimt conjures Luciano's former self from 20 years earlier. The elder can clearly see the absurdity of his younger life and the choices that he makes, right? However, the irony, of course, is that it is impossible for him to get the younger version of himself to see it, right? Later on, we move into the multiple reality syndrome. Here, Luigi Pirandello's Six Characters of an Author is an excellent example of this. The multiple reality complex refers to the sensation of two or more planes of reality that appear mutually exclusive, but which exist simultaneously. Both the mirror and the marionette promote similar realities in their own show, and Pirandello's Six Characters in Search of an Author is one of the most ideal demonstrations of this syndrome. During the rehearsal, basically the story goes like this. During a rehearsal for a melodrama, six unfinished characters suddenly appear, and they need to convince the actors to try and tell their story. Two planes of existence existing simultaneously. The influences of these grotesque elements permeated the theater and film in subtle ways over the years, right? It didn't exactly last as a pure form, but much like so many other things, naturalism, realism, etc., and commedia dell'arte, there's not necessarily a pure version of it nowadays, but the influence cannot be mistaken, okay? Like so many other 20th century movements, if you have a look, you can see the mirror syndrome in films like Gemini Man, Looper, the multiple reality syndrome in films like The Lake House and The Dining Room by A.R. Gurney, and the Marionette Syndrome, most aptly played by Gollum, right? So where did the concept and this idea of the grotesque actually come from? The term grotesque was not a movement. It was not an ism, okay? For those of you familiar with theater history in the early 20th century, there was a lot of isms. There was this ism and that ism and futurism and realism and that ism. It wasn't necessarily a movement. Nobody woke up one day and said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to create a manifesto, a grotesque manifesto. That didn't necessarily happen. What it was originally coined as a subtitle of a play by Luigi Chiarelli, The Mask and the Face, a Grotesque in 3 acts. First produced in 1916, and according to critics, the play was written as a tragedy, but the characters played it as a comedy, giving it its grotesque nature. This was picked up by the critics, who felt that the term was applicable to several plays around that time and even helped to describe some of the early works. They also started to apply it to early romantic works by people like Victor Hugo, right? The ideas of the grotesque were picked up by Luigi Pirandello and had a massive impact on his work, right? As you can see, in so many of the plays, there's a lot of different, there was a lot of different elements of the theater of the grotesque in Pirandello's work. So when researching the grotesque and the idea behind it, it seems as though it was most prevalent between 1916 and 1930, which was a bit early for Dürrenmatt, okay? Dürrenmatt's most prevalent years as a writer was between the 50s and the 90s. His satiric questioning of humanistic materialism and complacency led to some incredible works, right? The Visit, termed originally The Visit of the Old Lady, was written in 1955, became an instant classic. It was an immoral morality play, a study of communal guilt and corrupting power of money. Dürrenmatt asserted that comedy alone is appropriate to us. Our world has led to the grotesque as it has to the atomic bomb. The grotesque is our mode of perception, a physical expression of the paradox. To illustrate this point, he writes us a potential tragedy and then turns it into a mock heroic farce. Basic plot line is a wealthy woman offers her destitute hometown a fortune, $1 billion, if they agree to kill her ex-lover, a man who had jilted her years before. The people are starving, eating only poverty soup, watching trains go by as their last joy in life, right? And when the billionaire arrives, all hope is pinned on her generously helping and rejuvenating the town with her wealth and some of her money. And when the condition is laid out before them, naturally, the townsfolk all say, they balk at it. No, no, of course not, right? You can't possibly buy justice. Her response is, yes, you can. And they're like, well, we're not going to accept your offer. This is ridiculous. Why would we do that? At which point the lady simply says, I'll wait. And she does. And then we move into Act 2. We reemerge with a growingly paranoid Alfred Ill, desperately trying to convince himself that the town is behind him. Everybody said that they're not going to do it. Nobody's going to kill me. That's ridiculous. Why would they do that? Right? But everyone starts buying things on credit. A town that couldn't afford anything is suddenly purchasing all new yellow shoes, the finest cheese, the greatest tobacco, etc., all on credit. And when confronted with this, how could you possibly do this on credit? You don't know, you don't have any money, right? None of us have any money. And they're like, oh, well, you know, no, you could come, we might have a windfall, right? Who could tell, right? So the idea is there. It starts to build. Frantically, he starts to go to the authorities of the town. He starts to complain. He tries to have her arrested. On what grounds? She's helping us. Panicked, he rushes to the railway to leave. He finds that he can't. In the end, we learn that Claire has actually been slowly and quietly buying up the town, systematically bankrupting it, making sure that the people didn't just want her money, they need it, and putting an entire population into a position where they would do anything for it. And finally, Alfred gives in. And thus, we have a small, macabre demonstration of the ethical dislocation of a global economy. So the artistic vision of this, how do we get this across? Right? When looking at an artistic vision that'll guide a production, one is always on the search for clues, right? There's a wonderful letter to actors from a playwright that was published a little while ago. I can't remember exactly how it was put, but basically the way they said it, and I really love this, the way they said it was, you wake up in a hotel room, right? Or you wake up in a room with no idea who you are and no concept of your past or where you're going or why you're there. Inside that room are all the clues you could possibly need to find out everything about yourself. You just need to find the clues. The way that this is said makes it very simple. Basically, the room is the script. The character that you're playing is the person waking up in the bed, and you look through the script to find all of the clues. It's exactly the same thing from a directing point of view, okay? Similar for directors, the structure of a play is a play communicates through action rather than through a descriptive narrative, right? You don't have a chapter inside, well, George Bernard Shaw maybe a slight exception, but you don't have a chapter in a play that goes through and describes exactly what's going on. Most of the time it's led to interpretation. Oftentimes the stage directions of a play had been put there from the first professional production, which turned into a publication, right? So what we need to do is go through the actions. We should go through the action to find what will constitute an artistic vision for the show, okay? The first one is an antecedent action, taking place before and leading up to the beginning of the play. In the case of this play, this becomes incredibly important because so much comes down to the simple thought of, how did we end up here? How did we end up so poor? How did we end up so desperate for this person's money and this person's wealth? How did we end up in this state of, I will do anything for $1 billion, right? There was a trial. We know that. This is key. This is a key inciting incident that happened years before, which dictates the actions of all the lives before the play begins. There's poverty, there's suffering, which seems to have grown worse and worse, like living in a pot that is slowly coming to a boil without even noticing it. Later in the play, we learn that Claire Zachanassian has deliberately forced the town into this economic depression over a period of years, all part of an elaborate long game. We learn about Claire's life from being a prostitute to marrying wealth, to obtaining her own wealth, to growing into the richest woman in the world. Then you have an implied action. This is action that happens outside of the plot structure that is expressed indirectly, right? It comes in the form of a promise of wealth, right? Buying things on credit, everybody wearing new shoes, right? The denial that anything could possibly be changing and whatnot. You also have the potential action, which is what we anticipate happening, keeping the audience on the edge of the seat. Simply put, this is the death of Alfred Ill. While everything else is going on, there's this absurd feeling of waiting and anticipating when and if he's actually going to die. Is the townsfolk actually going to do this? Or is everybody going to turn around and say, no, of course, that's ridiculous, et cetera, et cetera. It was interesting, but just before this talk, we were talking about the film version of this play, where they actually altered the ending and made it a happy ending, right? Ill lives at the end. Dürrenmatt, not so much, right? And then, of course, you have the overt action. This becomes this is the action that is written directly into the play, what you see in front of you. And this becomes fascinating because nothing violent really happens, although it's anticipated. And it's that anticipation that becomes the action. Alfred slowly sinks into an abject panic at what seems to be inevitable to occur. This is very much this is very similar to Bertolt Brecht and his ideas in Waiting for Godot, where he turns waiting into an action. Right? And then we take into consideration the given circumstances, right? What struck me most about the play wasn't one person's revenge against another. It was the long game that Claire puts into motion, which manipulates the lives of an entire population. Her vengeance against one person and one event affects everybody in the town, okay? Her focus is on one individual, so please keep in mind, as we go through some of the artistic vision that we're going to be doing, a lot of this is going to change, because as we get into rehearsal, there will be various aha moments where I go, wow, that worked. And I'll have lots of ideas that'll be like, wow, tried that, didn't work at all. So to create focus, Claire and Il are the only two people in the play at the moment not masked, right? So what we're going to be doing is probably using masks and whatnot for the townsfolk in order to create an almost anonymity amongst them, right? The townsfolk will be actors playing multiple characters, most likely masked with all in black with key costume elements for identifying ideas and archetypes. In the play, Claire and Il, and I found this fascinating, are the only people with names. This was kind of an interesting concept, right? Branching out from expressionism, where everybody has an archetypal designation like lawyer, doctor, et cetera, Claire and Il are the only people with names. After that, it's mayor, school teacher, priest, this, that, et cetera, right? So the idea of using these masks, one of the things that we started playing with, and for camera's sake, I'm just going to move over here real quick. One of the things I want to start playing with is the idea of luminescence. How do you create a population? Okay. Now with masks, there are some interesting things that you can do, right? A person in black with a mask on can create a single person. However, put two masks inside of their hands, right? With a throng of black people in black, and all of a sudden you've got three people, and now you can create a little bit more of a crowd. But there's more than that. There are people that we don't see. There are people who aren't in the show who have all been affected by this sense of vengeance, which we thought was really interesting. So one of the things that we started playing with is the idea, could we start bringing these up, please? Right? What we started playing with is the idea of creating mannequins and bodies that we can use as a luminescent population, right? People that would could necessarily represent a background of a population that we don't even see, right? So scattering these around the set, right, and having them in the background, even dimly lit at certain times, in order to reflect basically the repercussions and the ripple effect and the wave effect of what's actually going on, right? Thank you very much. Bring them down, right? Is the idea of creating these mannequins that'll provide a lighting source, which would be great visual for the start at one point, but also it'll suggest a population that can dim and imply, dim and brighten to imply moods. In a crowd scene, one actor in black can manipulate three white masks, talked about that. What I thought was interesting about this is that it can help create that sense of so much going on in the distance. And that's one of the things that I really wanted to get across, right? So to illustrate a status dynamic, right? Claire is basically, she's a Baroquean allegory of everything that is opulent and wealthy. She is beyond human at this point, right? Her limbs are false, which is a not so subtle suggestion of her inhumanness. Her renaming of her entourage, right? Everybody who follows her, including her multiple husbands, are all renamed to Kobe and Lobi and Roby and Toby in order so that they all rhyme and it's easier to remember. And it, you know, as she puts it, it's much more pleasing to her, right? So one of the things that we'd like to try and do is make it, and again, I'm not entirely sure if this will work, but my goal is to make it so that she never touches the ground, which I'm not sure how to do yet, but I'm working on it. But I think it'll be interesting, right? It's the idea that she's carried everywhere. If she has to walk across the space, we can lay actors down and put a plank over top of them. She can walk across it. Things along those lines. She talks about being carried everywhere in a horse and chariot. And I think not touching the ground creates almost like a goddess type archetype inside of her. And because she is seen as that, and she never loses that. There is no fall from grace at all, right? She maintains that status level throughout the entire thing. So the costumes will certainly help on this. From a set design perspective, right? I'd like to take you through some of the ideas that I've got here. What this is a 3D rendering. Just right. We'll scan back here for a quick sec, as you can see, this is a 3D rendering of the Melusina Theater that we're in, right? And this is on a program called SketchUp that I use for set design a lot. And so what we're doing here essentially is creating a world that looks like it was opulent once, that looks like it was rich at one point. We are, by using this, what we're going to do is, broken walls, broken ceilings, but with textures that imply that there was wealth there at some point, right? And then from there, leaving the center space open, right? So we're not crowding the space. What we're going to be using is chairs and planks, much like this one right here, right? But with matching kitchen chairs that will be used to get the actors to create the scenes that they're in, right? So those scenes are going to create train stations, benches, bridges, forests, desks, cathedrals, all of the different locations that we actually have, right? The only even semi-realistic looking set piece will be down in the corner here, which will be the hotel room where Claire stays. Because through most of the second act, she simply sits in her hotel room. Her term, "I'll wait," is exactly that, and she does. While Il is running around frantically trying to find a way to survive this situation, she simply relaxes, plans her next wedding to an Italian film star, right? Nothing actually, breaking her change of concentration there. So to finish off there, so there'll be a few set pieces, give the impression of a crumbling township, something that was certainly impressive once that's fallen into disrepair, changes of location, chairs and planks with actors recreating the scenes in different locations, right? Between that, the luminescent mannequins, masks, we have possibly the idea of creating something actually really like a really interesting visual to tell the story, right? So a couple of experiments that we're doing with this one is we're going to do, we have 2 weeks of a show that is planned for the run. So in the first week, what we'll do is we'll do a live production of the show, which will be great. You can come buy tickets, right? And from March 2nd to about the 5th, we will do a live presentation. The second week, what we're going to do is we're going to rejig the set pieces and film it and create a 360-degree virtual production. See if it works. I think that would actually be fascinating, right? Shooting from scene to scene to see if we can actually create a virtual world where your audience perspective is one that is actually put into the center of the action that is going on all around you. And I think this style of theater would actually translate and work really well on that. If not, we'll see how it goes. But it's an experiment. We've been playing around with the idea of 360 and VR elements in a lot of this. And one of the things that I thought was actually fascinating, we'll get back into that real quick, is, oh yeah, that's Claire, sorry, right? Boom, is the poster concept that we're doing. So the poster concept for this show, and I invite you all, if you have your phones with you, feel free to scan this, right? What we'll do for the show is create a very simple thing, a very simple visual with visit, a silhouette of Claire, a silhouette. This isn't the actual poster. This is just the concept. We haven't finished the poster yet. But the concept is a visit with something and then a 360 and then a QR code. That QR code takes you into the center of a 360-degree photograph that we took where we're going to be putting all of the information for the show. In order to, if you get it, and I'll leave that up for now, if you get it, feel free to look around, scroll through, look around. It's a virtual, completely wrapped around environment. That'll be the information for the show and for the upcoming production. How to get tickets, when to do, etc. Stuff along those lines. So those are some of the ideas that we're going with on this particular production. As I say, fairly simplistic. It'll be really interesting to work with the Grotesque. We're going to be holding auditions on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, to fill it out. And then when we get into rehearsals on the beginning of February, end of January, beginning of February, and we will be using everything to try and create a fantastic and interesting way to tell this bizarre but wonderfully bit of theater, the Grotesque. And thank you very much for coming.